They score! They score!
Welcome to God's Playbook with your host, Father Rico Passero.
Lock at the 20, 10, 5, touchdown! Touchdown!
Let's play ball.
Welcome back to God's Playbook, friends. Today is the Lord's Day. We hear in the Gospel of today of Jesus reminding us of the importance that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. The disciples are quarreling of who's most important, totally losing the reality of what God is all about. It's not about comparing ourselves to one another. Rather, it's how am I living according to God's expectation? When it's about me and my ego, I'm not living according to the gospel message. When it's about God and others, I am living according to the gospel message. That beautiful word, if I want to be joyful, I need to live according to what joy represents. First, Jesus. What is God's intention? Then, others. How do I make sure others are looked after? And then finally, why? Yourself. In that order, the more we live our lives, the more we realize that indeed the first shall be last and the last shall be first. When we seek to love and show love, are we not filled with that same grace? When we're last looking after the needs of others, doesn't it leave us with a feeling of true happiness, purpose, and joy? The first shall be last and the last shall be first helps us to not think that we're better than anyone else, to put ourselves ahead of others, not just in a line at a store, but in our own minds. My needs are more important than that person. Therefore, we start to rationalize how we think. This is not what God expects. Jesus wants us to recognize this first shall be last and last shall be first. That's how God sees the world. The world sees someone as unimportant. God sees them as very important. The world may see someone because of their power and prestige as being VIP, very important. And God doesn't see it the same way. While he loves the individual, he's not moved by positions of power, authority, money, or wealth, prestige, or reputation. How many times in the scriptures when Jesus speaks of parables, I pick on the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Interesting how the poor man Lazarus gets a name, but the rich man is referred to as rich man. In other words, he isn't even given the dignity of a name. The world would make sure they knew the name of the rich man and perhaps forget about poor, lowly Lazarus. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. To God, he wants us all to be first by being the servants of one another. If Jesus knelt down at the Last Supper and washed the feet of his disciples, then he not only demands that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, but he shows it. He puts his money where his mouth is through his actions. He kneels down and does what slaves do, in fact, the lowest of the slave, because God is willing to serve us. And then he expects us, therefore, to serve others. This whole idea of denying oneself and following Christ, last week's gospel, and this week's of the first shall be last and the last shall be first, helps us to make a decision, a daily decision, perhaps several times a day, to really ask ourselves the question, am I willing to live according to God's expectation? Am I justifying a behavior that is appropriate given what Jesus expects of me? It also doesn't mean I'm any less important than anyone else. Sadly, a lot of people buy into those lies too. You are very important to God. You are his favorite. But God has many favorites. And so as such, he wants us to be respectful to one another, not to see ourselves as better or less, but be willing to get our hands and our feet wet, dirty, involved, whatever analogy you want to use. There's no one too important to serve. There's no one who's unimportant that shouldn't be served. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Even the notion of the children, and Jesus saying that children are to be respected at a time in which children were seen as property and an endgame as opposed to a brother or sister and child of God, a precious gift given to us by God. This speaks about dependency, vulnerability, and an openness. Jesus wants us to experience these traits so that way it can be easy for us to realize God's invitation of showing love by serving. It is in giving that we receive. And so as such, friends, let's spend the time this week to ask ourselves, how is God asking me to be last? What are ways in which I can elevate others to be first? Perhaps starting with small things and then focusing on bigger things. In my marriage, is my husband or wife number one? Or do I always put my needs first? With my kids, do I always have to exercise that I'm the boss? Or do sometimes I do things for them too? Allowing them to make decisions in their own lives so I lose a bit of control and teach them to build some character. In regards to my parents, am I respectful of them, whether I'm a young person or young at heart? At work, at play, at school, how can I find ways to make others first and myself last? This doesn't mean we have to lose or refrain from winning. But what it does mean is we're respectful to one another and we're responding to need. We see other as equal, beloved, important. And so in many ways, we are called to think differently, not as the world thinks. If you're not first, you're last. Second place is the first loser. These can be very negative and disappointing things to focus on. But when Jesus says the first shall be last and the last shall be first, he's speaking about reward. When we place ourselves last here on earth, our reward will be great in heaven. So it shifts the focus. It helps us to turn what might appear to be a negative situation into a very positive one. This is an opportunity of grace. This is a great way in which we can grow. This is a great way in which God can encourage us, lift us up, build us up. How is God calling us to be last? And not to do so in a very reluctant way where we're kicking and screaming all the way through. But rather, can I see this as a life lesson, an opportunity to grow, a way in which God may be humbling me in some way, shape, or form? How am I called to be last? What can I do to show God how much I truly love him? How can I respect those around me to show them that I respect them too? It's time, friends, to not just heed the teachings of Jesus, but to find ways to live by it. Lord, help me to stop putting myself first. Help me to be comfortable being last. Help me to realize the beauty of serving you and others. Help me to be more open to others' opinions. Help me to be more open to responding to need. Help me to be more like you. Help me to be more like you, Lord. For God's Playbook friends, I'm Father Rico. God loves you, and so do I.
If you like what you hear, please consider supporting us using any of our affiliate links in the description below via Buzzsprout, Ko-Fi, or GoFundMe. Thanks, and God bless.